we knew a couple of things going into this. The first is that in primary care, screening for alcohol use disorder, at least in any kind of formal way, is exceedingly low. When you look at those screening tools, their ability to capture high-risk drinking and alcohol use disorder is very poor. So in a nutshell, we have screening tools that don't work and people don't implement them. And that was the jumping off point for what we did. And I'm happy to get into the details of that. 3 drinks per week is still, your risk is very low, but there seems to be an inflection point in the data where above 2 drinks on any one occasion or 2 drinks a week, you start to see harms that were previously underappreciated. The idea is we're not just looking for alcohol use disorder, but we're looking for people that may be putting themselves at risk depending on their sort of demographic circumstances, let's say. People end up in sort of different boxes depending on where they are. Conversations can be very brief, or if it sounds like there's a problem, just entertain a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. Harms that were previously underappreciated. The idea is we're not just looking for alcohol use disorder, but we're looking for people that may be putting themselves at risk depending on their sort of demographic circumstances, let's say. People end up in sort of different boxes depending on where they are. Conversations can be very brief, or if it sounds like there's a problem, just entertain a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder.
So hello and welcome everyone to one of Alcohol Review's occasional short video news interviews. You'll find more on the webpage and YouTube show notes. Please like and subscribe on there and check the link to see the benefits of the full service. So let's get started. Around the world, many alcohol problems are identified too late or are never identified at all, meaning many people never receive the help and support they need. A paper published yesterday in the Canadian Medical Association Journal sought to provide a new time-saving and pragmatic way to screen for high-risk drinking. So I'm delighted to welcome on one of the authors, Professor Evan Wood, who's kindly allowed me to call him Evan, of the British Columbia Centre on Substance Use, to explain this new approach. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you so much.
Just to cut to the chase, there's more detail we can get into, and doubtless we will in a few minutes, but could you just explain on a practical level how this screening method works?
Yeah, I think, stepping back and just practically, we knew a couple of things going into this. The first is that in primary care, screening for alcohol use disorder, at least in any kind of formal way, is exceedingly low. So just to begin with, we know that we have a problem. And then second of all, when you look at the screening instruments that are most commonly sort of advocated for, the classic example that most people will have heard of is sort of the CAGE questionnaire, which is a 4-person, have you cut down, have you tried to cut down, are you annoyed when people talk to you about your drinking, do you get guilty, or do you ever have an eye opener? The other one that's sort of the more sort of structured formal WHO is the audit, the alcohol use disorders identification test. When you look at those screening tools, their ability to capture high-risk drinking and alcohol use disorder is very poor. So you have 2 problems. One, primary care physicians don't want to use these tools. Part of the reason is because they are so time-consuming. But actually, if you look at the psychometric properties, just from an evidence-based medicine perspective, to give an example, the audit, which is the one that's been most rigorously evaluated, we published a meta-analysis in 2023 in the Journal of the American Medical Association that showed that I think the sensitivity was about 70%. So about 30% of people with alcohol use disorder would slip past the screening test and be not defined as having a problem, and those are obviously false negatives. And then the other issue is that in Canada, at least, and it's evolving internationally, the identification of lower risk drinking is much lower than some of the traditional definitions, like the US NIAAA definition or the old Canadian definition. So in a nutshell, we have screening tools that don't work and people don't implement them. And that was the jumping off point for what we did. And I'm happy to get into the details of that.
Yeah, so I briefly looked at it's a sort of 5-point questionnaire, isn't it? And it centers on these new lower low risk drinking guidelines that you mentioned. That's the sort of crux of it, isn't it? Could you maybe just sort of work through the difference, of these different 5 stages and what they do and what they try and achieve?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So as you say, and there's been some controversy around this internationally. I think the WHO put out a statement saying, no level of alcohol use was safe for our health. And the Canadian, it's called Canada's Guidance on Alcohol and Health, has taken a sort of similar stance where 3 drinks per week is still, your risk is very low, but there seems to be an inflection point in the data where above 2 drinks on any one occasion or 2 drinks a week, you start to see harms that were previously underappreciated. And we don't need to get into the details of that, but in terms of the steps, the idea is we're not just looking for alcohol use disorder, but we're looking for people that may be putting themselves at risk depending on their sort of demographic circumstances. Let's say, for instance, a college student or a senior in high school might be involved in sort of heavy episodic drinking, or what we sort of call binge drinking. That's not alcohol use disorder necessarily, but that's the type of thing that places young people at risk of injury, young men at risk of violence, young women at risk of sexual assault, those types of things. So the idea with these steps is first just open up the conversation about alcohol, and you can do that in kind of a casual way. And just I talk to all my patients about alcohol, just like smoking. Is it okay if we talk about Canada's Guidance on Alcohol and Health today? That could obviously be adopted to an international context and to say, is it okay if we talk about alcohol today? And then for people that are drinking low amounts of alcohol, and in Canada they're quite low amounts, the recommendation is just to move on very quickly. Reinforce that that's the best thing for your health right now. That's where the evidence lies, is that less drinking is best, and then move on. So if somebody is there to get help for their toenail fungus or whatever reason that they've gone to the doctor, you are not taking the time to do the audit and score the audit and this sort of complex screening algorithm. The advice is to not do that, and I think that hopefully would be a sigh of relief for primary care physicians. And then ask people who are drinking above that level, sort of generically, if they have any problems with their alcohol use. And there's a suggested question that sort of asks about difficulty cutting down or controlling or continuing to drink despite having health or social problems related to your alcohol use. For someone who says, no, I don't have any problems, then you can just give tailored advice. Again, if it's a college student that's having heavy episodic drinking, that's different than someone who comes home after work every day and drinks between a half a bottle and a bottle of wine, but has had no consequences of that really and doesn't see it as a problem. The advice giving would be different in those circumstances. And then in individuals who do describe a problem related to alcohol use, they might say, yeah, I tried to do a dry January and I only made it to, mid-month, and then I found myself drinking again. Okay, let's talk about that. Oh yeah, I've been really trying to stop and I'm having a difficult time. Well, then don't do a screening test, because the pretest probability has suddenly gone up very high. Move directly to a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, because your listeners will know that the threshold for a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder is very low, and that's been criticized. So just 2 criteria need to be met. So, of course, there's no point in more screening. You could go directly to a diagnosis, with the caveat that, of course, mild alcohol use disorder is very different than moderate or severe alcohol use disorder. And someone with a mild alcohol use disorder, just some encouragement and strategies to reduce drinking might be enough to help them, and ideally intervening before things get worse. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, the approach. People end up in sort of different boxes depending on where they are. Conversations can be very brief, or if it sounds like there's a problem, just entertain a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder.
And is there a way to quantify the improvement in terms of time or other costs to the physician?
Yeah, that's something that would be, part of prospective validation. And I think that would be useful. And I think your question actually hits the nail on the head, because traditionally with these screening tests like the audit, the emphasis has been on the sensitivity, the true positive rate, the specificity, the true negative rate, and spending all this time trying to calculate these psychometric properties, when the reality is, and I sort of alluded to this, we don't really have a great handle in terms of diagnosing alcohol use disorder. in terms of the field trials of the DSM-5 showed that the kappa, or the agreement between two assessors, is only about 0.4, which translates into, in perfectly trained individuals in settings where the prevalence of alcohol use disorder is kind of perfect to maximize diagnostic, perfection, two independent assessors will disagree about a third of the time. And so the point being there, if you think of screening for, let's say, breast cancer, the gold standard diagnosis is a biopsy where you look at the tissue under the microscope and you can confidently say, this person has cancer, that person does not have cancer. And then you could calculate the sensitivity and specificity of something like a mammogram and know with some confidence what you're talking about. But when the gold standard measure, like the alcohol use disorder diagnosis, you don't even really know with certainty whether the person has an alcohol use disorder or not. That use of sensitivity and specificity is probably not that useful. And as you alluded to, what's the time saving? What's the acceptability to patients? Does this really help us save time and triage our efforts to help people? Those are really the questions that I think are before us now as this gets implemented.
And I think you touched on it earlier, that there are the lower guidelines, the controversial lower guidelines are something, well, 2 Canadian drinks per week or 2 per day, which I think translates into 34 milliliters of alcohol, or in my sort of layman's terms, 1.5 big European sized beers. And that's the sort of branching point at which people start to be given advice or what have you. What's the sort of logic behind that?
Well, the logic is that there's on those two paths, at that first branch point above or below the Canadian guidance, if you're below the guidance, move on quickly. And you don't need to spend a lot of time. Hey, that's great. Good work. That's where we want people to be right now from a public health perspective. If you're above that, most people are not going to have an alcohol use disorder. So then getting into a lot of detailed screening is probably not worth anyone's time. Just figure out the person's pattern of alcohol use. If it's 3 drinks per week, again, you don't need to spend a lot of time. You could say, oh, you're right down near the, where we like to have people be. That's great. Technically, the cutoff is 2. But if on the average week you only have 3 drinks, good job. That's healthy. If somebody again says they're a binge drinker, or they drink, 4, strong drinks with spirits every night, but they don't feel they have a problem with it and they thought they were doing something good to reduce heart attack and stroke, then that's a kind of a different conversation. And then someone who's like, well, I did have a driving under the influence charge last year and I've really been struggling since then, then that's a different approach too. So it's really about what you might call that sort of alcohol use phenotype and adding sort of advice and support for people accordingly. Because that I think just the knowledge of I think even in Canada where these guidelines have been well publicized, most people, if you stop them on the street and said, do you think a glass of wine is good for your heart if you have a big glass of red wine every day, they'll probably say yes. And that work is independent of what we've done, but I think that literature is being called into question now.
And what's the next step for this? So you've obviously published a paper in this very esteemed journal. Is it, but that's another step is getting people to actually use it sort of in the field or in trials, or what do you do next to see if it works?
Yeah. Different jurisdictions describe what's next in different terms. Some people talk about implementation science. In Canada, we often talk about knowledge translation. So we'll shift into the knowledge translation phase here. And the nice thing about the Canadian Medical Association Journal is it's free and it lands on the desk of every physician in Canada. And usually a guideline like this will then, it'll go into medical school curriculum or residency program curriculum. We're doing webinars. It was produced by a national network where we kind of have thought leaders across the country, and we hope this will get picked up in rounds, presentations, and that kind of thing. But just like probably every international setting, the Canadian healthcare system is groaning under the strain of different needs and priorities. And I'm not naive to the fact that many physicians are just trying to get through their workday and get through what they have to do to pay their overhead get their patients seen. But this is intended to be very much a cost-saving effort, and I think those implementation science questions will naturally unfold because there's a whole industry of people that are focused on screening and assessing screening tools and critically appraising those screening tools. And this, we welcome that type of critical appraisal of what we've proposed. And ultimately, there may be some refinement over time, but we think that implementation science should look at the things like you've alluded to, the time saving, the ability to identify people who might benefit from intervention, and focusing energy there.
And this is probably one for the real sort of nerds amongst us, but the guidelines we've been talking about are separate, I believe, to the government low risk guidelines, which are, a lot higher, put it that way, sort of 10 drinks per week for women and 50% higher for men, and 2 standard drinks per day for women and 3 for men. Where does that put Canada in terms of sort of guidance in general?
That's been a real head scratcher, to be honest. I haven't been directly involved in Canada's guidance on alcohol and health. That's this now new, much lower level. And then you're alluding to these kind of outdated, lower risk guidelines that, again, 15 drinks per week for men or 10 for women. And the federal government has kept that old guidance up there. And I'm not really sure what the explanation for that is. Is it just the wheels of government turn so slowly, or is it the politics of it? I know when the WHO statement came out in the US, there was some pushback insofar as people saying, oh, government's going to try and take our beer away. And, I think it was Senator Ted Cruz said something like that. And I think if you actually look at Canada's guidance on alcohol and health, it's really sort of more sort of libertarian in its education for people. It's like people can choose to do what they want. This isn't a nanny state scenario, but people should be armed with the latest evidence. And if they've been misinformed to think that, being a heavy red wine drinker is going to improve your longevity, for women, it looks like the sort of cirrhosis and concerns related to, what we would call heavier alcohol use now are much lower than they were thought to be. And obviously the heavy episodic use is associated with risks for men and women and these types of things. So that you've pulled behind the curtain and identified something that for me as well is a point of curiosity. And I don't have an explanation. I don't know why the federal government funds an agency like the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction to produce these Canada's guidance on alcohol and health, and yet these historical guidelines, were you to search, you might land on those, even though it wasn't your intention. It's a curiosity.
I guess that there is a way to keep 2 audiences happy at the same time. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that may be their intention. I'm honestly, I'm not sure because I know there's been some consternation and lobbying on the part of the alcohol industry with the federal government. I don't have firsthand knowledge of that, but colleagues who are part of those conversations and were part of the new guidance have shared that information. I think there's always a political calculation. Are they going to get blowback for suggesting less alcohol use? And I don't think that has really manifest, but certainly, like I said, in the US, when that WHO statement came out, and I think someone from the National Institute for Alcoholism in the US kind of said, hey, we may need to shift our guidelines. And as you may know, the US, I think, has got rid of those guidelines altogether now. So I think there's always a political calculation in this thing. And, I view this as, alcohol use is part of our culture. It's, there's many benefits that people derive socially and other things from alcohol use. I think it's really for people to be armed with the best intervention, and for people that alcohol is having consequences, enabling healthcare providers to focus their energy there and less time being spent where it's not needed, as historical screening recommendations sort of landed, including our own, the 2023 guidelines in hindsight are kind of unimplementable in terms of suggesting everybody use the audit and multiple screening tests and this kind of thing.
Okay, well, many thanks for your time. I now realize how important physicians' time is. So thank you very much for jumping on.
Thank you so much for your interest. All my best.